How's that microphone? Does that come in loud and clear? Great. Excellent. Well, Theodore, thank you so much for having me. Dean Mazur, thank you very much. Dr. Chowders, thank you very much. What I want to do for a few minutes is talk quite personally, actually, to give you a sense of what it's like to live in Ukraine right now, to cover the war in Ukraine, and to experience the horrors of a not-so-modern, unfortunately, war that we are all experiencing. And I'll go for about 20 or 25 minutes, and I will be personal, and part of this is to the journalism students in the room, because I think there are some messages that I'd like to think that I've learned through my reporting trips in Ukraine, but also covering 6 conflicts in the last 20 years. And then we'll zoom out. We'll talk about the politics of the moment. We'll talk about what led us to here, what the chances of Ukraine and succeeding in its goals in terms of evicting Russia from all occupied territories, and what the future brings. But for a little while, if you'll indulge me, a few stories about journalism, war correspondence, and perhaps we'll talk about resilience as well. So I want to start with a scene from October. A few months ago, I found myself in a small city in Ukraine called Balaklia. Ukrainian soldiers had just liberated the 25,000 residents of the city from Russian occupation. And in the middle of the town was a Ukrainian police station that the Russians had used as one of their police or intelligence or military headquarters. And we walked inside this police station with Ukrainian police, basically the equivalent of the CSI, and we began a tour into the heart of darkness. The Russians had slept in the basement, which was lined with cots and discarded Russian cups of noodles. On the middle floor, Russians detained Ukrainian men in small cells of solitary confinement. Each was about 5 feet wide and 10 feet long. On one of the walls, the Ukrainian prisoner had scratched a line for each day he spent in detention. There were 30 scratches. In another cell, a Ukrainian prisoner had scratched the Lord's Prayer, which, if you know, includes the line, "Deliver us from evil." Then we went upstairs. The Russians commandeered the police commander's offices and turned them into what can only be described as torture chambers. Russians had not cleaned up before they fled. They left behind the wire that they used to strangle, the broken off baton they used to beat and sodomize their Ukrainian prisoners, the electricity source they used to electrocute, the devices of dehumanization. The police then took us to a nearby graveyard. There were dozens of rows of smartly dug graves, each marked with a gravestone or a placard marking the names of the dead and the years in which they lived and died. But at the edge of the graveyard, the rows stopped. The gravestones stopped. Neatly dug graves had been replaced with mounds of dirt sitting side by side. No markings, just an occasional cross above hastily dug graves. And under one of those mounds of dirt lay a Ukrainian named Maxim Shalikan. A few months before, Russian occupiers had tortured him in that room that I just described, murdered him, and gave his body to his brother to hastily bury. The grave diggers began digging. Not a new grave, Maxim's grave. The police needed to exhume his body in order to document his torture. There were a few journalists, including myself and my team, as well as police investigators. And among those watching was a woman in her 50s named Svetlana, Maxim's mother. She watched the unwatchable. The son she had birthed pulled out of what was supposed to be his final resting place. It was awful. The scene, the stench, the horror on her face, I can still remember it and smell it right now. Police prodded his partially decomposed body. In its dehumanization of its perceived Ukrainian enemies, Russia had stolen the dignity from even the dead. At this point, I had to walk away. I couldn't take it anymore. I sat behind a small shack and cried. I've cried a lot in interviews over the years. I think it's one of the most important things we can do as journalists, keep ourselves open to emotion. And I cried in part because I had witnessed Svetlana watching Maxim's grave, but I had also seen my wife over our infant son's grave and my mother over my own. I can still smell the body, I can still close my eyes and see Svetlana's face. And I can still see so many scenes of trauma across a half dozen war zones and natural disasters, from Katrina to Ukraine, to Gaza, to Pakistan. So many scenes of loss, so many parents who had to bury their children. Svetlana's trauma is unspeakable. What of those who tell her story? The journalist, the translator, the camera person who interrupts one of the single worst moments of her life and asks, "How are you doing? How are you feeling? Tell me about your son. Tell me about your son." It's the nature of that question, that request, that I'm going to talk for a few minutes about. Because if journalists are to be resilient as we share stories of horror, we must believe it is okay to make that request, to ask her question. We must believe that we are not exploiting Svetlana, but creating empathy in our audience for her and her family. We must believe that by asking Svetlana about her son, he transforms from a statistic into a story, from a number into a person. We must believe that by sharing her story and her son's, we are recapturing what the Russians twice stole: her son's dignity, her son's humanity. Tell me about your son. To do what journalists do and remain resilient, we must believe in the catharsis of storytelling, and that our own empathy, which also allows us to tell her story and makes us so vulnerable, can also be our shield. The author Leslie Jamison wrote a book of essays called The Empathy Exams, and Leslie Jamison learned about empathy as a medical actor. She plays sick. Her role is a 23-year-old female patient who tells a psychiatry student about her seizures, about her character's seizures. The patient that Jamison plays does not realize the seizures began because her brother drowned. She thinks it's somehow biological. So the students examine the character that Jamison is playing and try and unlock the mystery. And afterward, Jamison judges them and gives them report cards on their bedside manner. First, whether they voice empathy, whether they actually say, whether it comes out of their mouths, "Oh my goodness, I cannot imagine. That must be so hard." But Jamison also judges them on whether they unlock the fact that her seizures are a psychological product of the trauma that she experienced when her brother died. And to discover that, they must demonstrate an empathy that goes beyond exhibiting compassion. They have to voice compassion and ask the right question. In other words, empathy is not only about remembering to say, "Geez, that's hard. I cannot imagine what you're going through." Empathy is is shining a light and figuring out how to shine that light on trauma so it can be seen in the first place. Empathy is not just listening, it's asking the questions that deserve to be listened to. Empathy comes from the Greek. Em is into and pathos is feeling, into feeling. That's a kind of travel into a person's feelings, into a person's pain. That's what I believe we journalists must do in order to share someone's story. We don't ask the traumatized to relive their trauma. That's not what we're trained to do. We invite them to share their trauma with us. We invite them to communicate their fears, their memories, their hopes, the awful moments that brought us both to that moment. We invite them to tell us their story, to unveil the very attributes that make them, that make us human, and that give us all dignity. Tell me about your son. We sit with our characters, probe their memories and emotions, not to exploit, but to understand, to unlock that which is vital to share. And to tell their story, we must demonstrate empathy. We must demonstrate the willingness to travel into their pain. We must not only voice empathy, but figure out which questions to ask. We must find the trauma so we can understand it, and then hopefully communicate it in a way that is memorable and meaningful to an audience many thousand miles away. And if we want our viewers or listeners or readers to care, then we better hell is care ourselves. I hope that the tears that I referenced earlier are not crocodile tears. And I don't think they are, because despite the 6 wars that I covered, I'm still shocked by what some armies and what some people are capable of doing to other people. I cry because I still feel the pain of their loss, even if I have the privilege to lead the community. Turn this on. This one? Right. There? Yeah, right. I cry because I believe that I feel their pain, even if I have to or I get to leave the community, and they don't have that privilege. I cried a few months ago north of Kharkiv, what used to be Ukraine's second largest city, the largest city in Eastern Ukraine. And I cried with a 65-year-old Ukrainian named Anatoly Kropach outside this. Kharkiv had recently, or this area out that Kharkiv had recently been liberated by Ukrainian soldiers, and the Russians had left behind more horror. A Russian tank had fired on a car with a family in it as they tried to escape east from Kharkiv. The tank shell destroyed the car and set it on fire. That day, the Russians killed a man named Andriy and his daughter, 9-year-old Ksenia. Burned out shell of the car had sat there for months until that day, and Ukrainian police investigators were able to find the region. Kropach was not one of those investigators. He was the father of Andriy, the man killed in the car, and the grandfather of Ksenia, the girl killed in your car. So I asked Andriy, tell me about your son. We had a good cry. I asked him, why are you here? He answered something that I can only understand now that I have a son. How could I not be? Being here, being there, of course, is what journalists do. And yet, doing that is exactly what makes us vulnerable to post-traumatic stress. In my experience, the extent of my injury, and I do acknowledge it is an injury, correlates directly to how deeply I went, how far I traveled into people's pain. That seems to be a genuine occupational hazard. That which allows me to do my job, that which allows us journalists to do our jobs, is the very thing that creates burnout, the very thing that leads us to be overwhelmed, self-destructive as well. If I can be honest, I haven't been great at self-care over the years. I lived in Afghanistan and Pakistan for 4 years. Did a lot of embeds with American troops in Afghanistan. My first exposure to combat, to the threat of injury, of death. I responded with a little drinking, perhaps a little proverbial candle burning at both ends. And I looked around at some of my fellow war correspondents, especially men in their 40s and 50s and 60s, and boy, did they have great stories to tell. But they also told stories of broken marriages, children they didn't speak to, families lost to an addiction or adrenaline. I don't think I ever lost control. I have never understood my feelings, and I coped with them as best I could. I think there are coping mechanisms that journalists can find. Self-care that you read about in books, exercise, yoga, Pilates, anything that move that allow you to move the sweat, the sublimation of all of that tension. Personal self-care tips, anything that you consider meditative, my old friend Dan Harris, who left ABCDs to become a professional meditator. Makes a lot of money now and be able to. He describes meditation as being 100% present. You don't have to have some fancy gadget or be in a particular place. You can meditate by the act of turning a doorknob and thinking about only that or that. Resets are great. All resets, all breaks are important. Copy breaks, in my case, leaving war zones and leaving the point where we witnessed Trump. Bill is a structural coping, therapy, collaboration, talking with colleagues. But I think those personal and structural coping mechanisms are not enough. And I've come to believe that this third form of COVID is most important. To believe in the importance of journals, believe in the importance of our craft, believe in the catharsis of storytelling. But to make this last point, one last word. In 2014, I was reporting live from Gaza in a almost 2-month war that Israel waged on the Hamas group, which the U.S., Europe defines terrorist group, which is also the political leadership of us. And at one moment, there were so many explosions around me, they actually overwhelmed the sound of my own voice. And I knew that the explosions were so loud, my own viewers couldn't hear. So I said to the anchor I would wait until the explosion stopped. Staring into the camera for a few seconds felt like an eternity on television. And I remember trying to keep my face neutral, but the anchor's face went absolutely white. He apologized to our viewers for, quote, keeping me out there and said I would get to a safe place, as if there were a safe place. A few minutes later, my phone nicked. It was a text from my mother. About it in a minute. Unfortunately, she had been watching, and you cannot go before I do. It took me years to admit that I had been naive and assumed that I could become a war correspondent and not emotionally harm myself and my family. Gaza, Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Ukraine, these are like merit badges on a conflict reporter's sash. They're also these scars that take years to heal. During periods of doubt, I have wondered whether my reporting was worth the risks and the costs. I've lost relationships, become disconnected to people I loved, burdened people whom I loved with an anxiety created only by my professional choices. And I wondered at times whether I was motivated by the thrill rather than the substance of the scores. But I've come to believe that the same empathy that made me vulnerable helped steel me by giving me purpose. I've come to believe the act of writing Svetlana's story allowed me to process the trauma I'd been exposed to. The act of sharing Svetlana's story provided the reason for taking my risks, for putting my family through the pain of having to watch me stay silent as the missiles exploded. And therein is a purpose that I believe ultimately creates resilience, to transform horror into human, to recapture stolen dignity, to humanize that which has been dehumanized. Tell me. So that was obviously about journalism and my own ideas about how to become a war correspondent and what it is that we do. So I'm happy to talk about that for a few minutes before we start our panel, or if anybody has questions on Russia and Ukraine, I will do most of the questions during the panel, not most of the talking, but wanted to open up.
What's your assessment of where the Ukrainian-Russian situation stands today? For another 2 years of war in place, or a break, or presidency of China is actually a mediator for part of way to put that.
So calling on that, and I will defer to our expert in a few minutes on some of these questions, but a couple of thoughts. So I've made 4 trips to Ukraine last year. I covered the initial invasion of Ukraine and annexation of Crimea in 2014 for multiple months. I went back to Ukraine in 2016 and 2018. So it's a country I care deeply about. I spent a lot of time in. And I think what we have to understand, and we will talk about it later, is that when a country pays such a high price, when the pain inflicted is so horrific, you demand a commiserable war. 91% of Ukrainians define a victory as re-seizing Crimea. Right? 9 years ago, Russians invade Ukraine for the first time. Green men, what history there? We'll do the short. They annexed Crimea. Not much of a fight. It was put up by the West or by Kyiv. And they invade eastern Ukraine, and a line of contact is created through which Ukrainian soldiers and Russian soldiers, but Russian soldiers backing local forces, proxy forces actually, in the Donbass and Donetsk and Luhansk, create a front line. So there's actually trench warfare for the last 9 years. And the Russian regular forces invaded and pulled back, so mostly these irregular forces have been escalated. And then we get the full-scale invasion 1 year ago. So Ukraine has been fighting this war for 9 years. Kyiv has been fighting this war for 9 years. Many Ukrainians have wanted to fight this war because they want their future in Europe. And then in the last 13 months, 14 months, you get the horrors of war crimes that we saw in Bucha and Mariupol. You get Ukrainian children kidnapped by 1,000, recreated as Russian propaganda inside Russia. So nobody in Ukraine's leadership has any room to make a deal, even if they wanted to, which they don't. And even if Vladimir Putin was interested in making a deal, which he's not. Putin annexed 4 oblasts, 4 regions of Ukraine, including, 2 that he barely controls and 2 that he controls about half of, without the ability to actually defend the territories in there, and yet calls them Russia forever. He has boxed himself in. He's boxed in Russia forever. So I'm very cynical, I will be honest, about this war ending anytime soon. As Ukraine will keep fighting it, Russia will keep fighting it. Which leads to, a conversation about later, but will the West continue to support Ukraine as Ukraine needs it? And there are open questions about that. But will Russia have the ability to field the modern military that it has? Clearly, it has a lot of shortages right now, and so is reverting to more traditional mid-20th century, early 20th century tactics, which the Russian Empire and Soviet you often revert to. And so I think the war will go on, sadly, and I don't think China will put its thumb on the scale through peace negotiations, because it's not clear that that's what they really want, and again, South Korea's side is interested. But if Beijing decides to arm Russia and fill in the gaps created by Russia's sword shortages, precision-guided munitions, let alone, it's the artillery, then it's a big crowd, because, the U.S. as it is, the European Union as it is barely giving Ukraine what it needs to hold the line and hopefully launch this counteroffensive coming up. The thought of Chinese supply going into Moscow to refuel its ability to fight against the West's, so far, unity, but, it's unclear to me logistics are there for a long time. That would make a huge difference.
Hi, thank you again for coming. So as a journalist, you are interviewing and talking to several people all the time, especially in war zones. Do you ever have the chance to follow up with them or remain close contact, like being able to talk to that mother again after that story?
I did talk to her, and sometimes it but and talked to her, and sometimes that's a language issue. Although my Ukrainian colleague got it. talk with her, but we haven't done that. But yeah, I've actually gone back quite a bit to people who I interviewed, and that's what I've loved about places I've lived. So with Pakistan, I was sure there's people with, but in Ukraine, I've been back on top, and I do follow it up, and some of the most memorable scores so far, and they're both memorable but also heartbreaking stories that I've had are with families who I connect with years before, and I reconnect with. And I think that journalists have such a hard time getting beyond the day that it's wonderful for us, but also wonderful for our viewers to see what happened when we were last here a year ago, 10 years ago. But it's also goes the other way. I had a woman contact me a couple of weeks ago who wrote that I had interviewed her fiance in Ukraine. He was an American fighter in the Foreign Legion, and emailed me to tell that he had the job. And then she wanted me to set her the interview that I did the two. So unfortunately, it goes both ways. And I'm going to do a story with her the next 2 months. So it's a good question, and it's something the journalists don't do enough. But I think it's something we should do as often. It was a hand gathered. And I was curious, introduce yourself, sorry. Sorry, I should have said that before, but
Ben, introduce yourself. Oh, hi, my name's Gabriel. I was just student here at college, and I'm very fresh in conflict of Ukraine here. I'm curious about kind of the process that you go into with kind of deciding like who and where to conduct investigations and interviews. Like Mr. Lonan is fairly like a civilian, like you talk to people who are like serving in combat as well, or like what this isn't so, but
yeah, all of the above. I'd like to think that we are open to what the news is, and so inside of the story, if you will, inside of a conflict like Ukraine, there are waves, there are moments in time, and so when we were there for the Asian and for the full scale day, and the month after, it was just anything that happened at all, and it just tried to find to talk to who were experiencing what was going on, but it was not difficult. And then a year later, I went back for 3 weeks for the 1-year anniversary, and that was more of things were set pieces, right? So I spent time with 5 units on the front line, for example. We did a story solely about drones, to a story solely about Russian war crimes. So, I think it's a product of the news. But if one of the motivations for questions who decides, I think journalists pride ourselves on the fact that, we are humans making decisions based on what we think. We don't, I don't think there's any notion that, from 50 or 60 years ago, that the anger white mask, or would be behind the desk, of course, without exception, somehow knows more than the rest of us and therefore can talk before. I don't think we think for that ourselves that way, nor should we. I think we think of ourselves as trying to, whatever the job is, right, create empathy in our audience, trying to investigate, trying to hold the powerful to account, and try to do data journals. There's so many versions of this. And we do what interests us, and we do what we think is important. It's always that balance between giving the traditional, reader of a newspaper, snap the full look at, hopefully the top right, that's the most important story of the day that the editors think is most important for you. Not necessarily the one that you might be most interested in. And I think that, if there are questions about the media, I'm not one of these people who disparage media at all, so I don't do media anymore. But what I do hope is that we figure out long-term a way to make sure that that top right portion of the newspaper, at the front page of the newspaper, the story that editors think is most important, is always available to viewers or readers or editors, because right now the algorithm gives you what they read. And I think that's not always ideal. So I think it's always about
our current professor journalist is What languages do you speak, and what obstacles or opportunities have languages presented to you as you try to tell story?
I think it's a great question. It's a profound question. I've read it a lot, and I say it's a profound question because it should not imperil my reporting. Now, does it? Sure, I admit it. So when I lived in Pakistan, I spoke Urdu and Hindi. I've lost that. I lived in Israel. I spoke decent Arabic, never learned Hebrew. I did not speak Yuvet. I did not speak Russian. And what I genuinely believe, and there are some who disagree, like especially scholars, will say you can't be in China. There's a huge debate. China scholar community can't be a real China scholar plus you can speak Mandarin. I genuinely believe that I do not need to speak Ukrainian to connect with people that speak Ukrainian. You may disagree, but I have a local journalist, traditionally you call fixers, but they're not really fixers, they're journalists, who I work with, I have worked with since 2014. His English is impeccable, and he understands my nuance. And when I believe, when I look somebody in the eye and demonstrate that empathy, demonstrate that I give a shit if we give my grades, and genuinely ask questions that demonstrate a willingness to understand what that person is going to and travel into their pain, I think most people open up. They really do. I don't need to speak their language, and they don't need to speak mine. I hope to understand what I'm communicating to them, and of course with the help of a very good translator who is right next to me, who communicates my tone as much as the words. I know there's people who disagree, and when I lived in Pakistan, Afghanistan for 4 years, people who parachute, you call it, into Kabul or Islamabad for a week or two, I would criticize for not knowing the story well enough. Yeah, so sure, I get it. You have to be completely local. But I just genuinely think that there is an ability to connect as human beings beyond what's Howard Ballard.
My name is Matt Taylor, professor of political science, the chair of English studies. Not to go backwards, but to talk a little bit more about Russia and Ukraine. If these two sides are as dug in as you described, what are the long-term political implications for Russia domestically? Do you envision that, whether or not the military coup can be gone, is the Russian state going to fracture into a bunch of ethnic enclaves? As I understand it, the Russian economy before the war could decline by like 3% at GNP or something. And I'm just wondering whether at some point, what are the long-term consequences?
So on the state of the Russian economy, it certainly was better at the beginning of the war than a lot of people gave credit to. And in fact, Putin took a lot of steps the last years to solidify the economy in ways that had proved pretty resilient. Whether that's just outperformed reserves that he had on February 23rd, 2022, his nascent efforts to create supply chains, insulate himself from some of the sanctions. You can't do that totally. But, I've talked a lot, especially like Nordic and Eastern European companies that work with Russia, and they describe these steps that they took even on a kind of business-to-business level that Russian businesses were insisting on in the last few years. They were curious at the time, and they look back and think, this was all part of the plan, and they expected the disconnect from the West. So I think the economy was a little bit better than some people would have. And it's been more resilient than the West has wished it to be, for sure. But long term, of course, Russia faces gigantic. Militarily, I mentioned some of them, unclear to anyone whether they can have the levels of artillery that they need extended to next year, the year after, let alone to 5 years. Unclear that the emergency steps that the head of the central bank, who's very impressive, she took steps that westward, whether those emergency steps can hold. And I think that what the West is doing, not only with the sanctions, but the export controls,
is I think probably we'd get to a point where Russia will struggle to field its military as it existed on February 23rd in 5 years. So that's for Beijing. Now, does that lead to economic collapse? Does that lead to fragmentation? I don't know. There are historians, there are scholars at the table who are going to answer that better than I can. The only thing all day that there's no obvious evidence that anyone of import or influence questions this money, in part because of the structure that Putin has created where national security apparatus actually fights each other rather than force together, and because he's thrown a lot of people out with this. And there's no evidence that the Russian population is turning against the war in Bagratianos. However, as we'll talk about, Russian and Soviet history are full of examples where all of a sudden, right? You know, the Tsar's number 25 is like, it was pretty smart, you know, or, you know, the Soviet leader's XYZ turns out to be somebody who is not trustworthy. So, you know, and then the story of the church. Oh, it's another, you know, then with all that. So I'll do the during this thing and say, well, could be one and could be the other, but I think over there, so.
As a mother and as a former journalist, I just want to say thank you very, very much for your deep commitment to empathy and to telling the stories and humanizing those that have been dehumanized. I think everyone in the audience here is deeply committed to listening to those stories and to affecting positive change. At least that's my hope as a university professor. How can, in our culture where there is so much feedback, there is so much noise, how can we encourage others to tune in?
So there are a few ways to answer that. One is kind of generational and journalistic. You know, how do you get, you know, a young student or a young person who's used to having at his or her fingertips audio, video, text from anywhere in the world instantly as told by a professional journalist and a citizen who just wanted to upload something. How do you get that person to watch a documentary about Putin? Some of them are very interested. Some of them are not. And there are answers if we go down that route, then I believe media like mine, quite legacy, quite old school, if you will, are trying to do just logistically in terms of the platform that we're on. But I would like to think that the answer to that question, whether from the kind of journalistic logistics perspective or the societal perspective, and this is my purely optimistic hat speaking down, is what mindset is that good stories are found because people want to read them. You know, there's all sorts of studies about how young people, or people under 40, consume journalism, and there's no brand, right? It's just they find a good story on Deeds, they can Twitter that, Instagram or TikTok or however they get. And so with that comes, with like a little bit of, oh no, you know, why are they reading the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and Washington Post? Must read the New York Times today, right? Make a process about it. Five to the rest. We didn't know it.
I've thought about. I'm not something we've.
I think that genuinely good stories just emerge. They become popular. They go viral, right? I mean, bad stuff goes viral too, but like genuinely good stuff will be man. And so I have faith in that, and I do have faith that, and I'm not going to become political, that our leaders who do the equivalent of telling good stories, right, whoever they are, will connect
with people, will reach people, even as the country obviously suffers from levels of political splits that we haven't seen. And so, I don't know if that's a particularly good answer to the question. Let's just keep on telling good stories. But, I think there is something to it. And I think that beyond, teaching civics from a young age, I really do believe that as journalists or as beyond journalism, as leaders, which we believe that whether we tell better stories or just try to connect better or try and do what we've been doing even better, that the competition isn't bringing us down, but is forcing us to elevate. We approach it like that. I think people will too. I really did. So we've got running out of time. So if anyone had one last question, we'll take one more. Otherwise, we can transition to the real experts. And anyone else? All right, why don't you guys come on up? It doesn't matter where you sit. Which microphone do you need me to be on? Can I have to stay on the microphone I'm on, or do I need to switch some? Okay, great. And so the microphone for them is this one. Okay, and I can turn the knob, or I need to turn my nostril. Well, clearly from the comment. Right now, okay. Okay, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Yeah, test, break. Okay. So I've been talking for a while, and so now we want to get to the real experts here. And we got about 50 minutes or so. So what I'd like to do here is I will go for about 30 minutes or so with everyone, and then we'll open at the end. So let me start right here. To my left, Dr. Ellis Mansi is a Senior Research Associate at the Baker Center and a lecturer in International Security and a NATO Field School faculty at Simon Fraser University. Natalie Rice is a researcher at the CCI Research and Innovation Center focused on disinformation, propaganda, and other information warfare used by Russia and other states. Vitalia Kushko is a PhD student at the Hasselman College of Business. She studies how small business owners in Ukraine are coping amid the ongoing war and has been coordinating relief efforts to the Ukrainian people since the start of Russia's full-scale invasion. It's so brilliant. So if you want to talk about the history, at least the last 9 years of this, she knows it better than anyone. And Professor Best Levichas, how to do? Is a professor in the Department of History who focuses on German relations with Eastern Europe. From 2008 to 21, he served as director of the Study for War and Society. So thank you very much, all of you. Welcome. I referenced this before, but let me just set the stage a little bit. 14 months of war, $100 billion investment by the United States, $70 billion from the European Union has led us to a critical singular moment, which is that Russia has dug in and is waiting for the Ukrainian counteroffensive, which we expect to start in the coming weeks and months. 40,000 Ukrainian troops have been trained. They've gotten 3,000 armored vehicles from the Americans, from all the Europeans, and they're just going to start driving south or east or maybe north and fake us all out. Who knows? The Ukrainians are good at deceiving us for the better. And that they need to achieve some level of success in their own statement to totally deoccupy their territory. And so that is the setup for what I'm going to start with, which is the present. And then we're going to go to the past because we have an incredible historical perspective on this panel, and then we'll go to the future. So Ellis Wassi, let me start with the present. How important is this moment, militarily and politically, and how difficult will it be for Ukraine to achieve that goal, deoccupy all of this territory?
Well, I think Ukraine, as well as the West, is at a critical moment because for over a year now, NATO countries on a bilateral basis have supplied Ukraine with a lot of armaments, a lot of training for the troops, and a lot of supplies. If Ukraine is to make a dent into Russian-occupied territory, right, it would be low. And it is very important that they are successful, because his successes now will allow the Europeans and the Americans to continue to support wholeheartedly Ukraine. Minor successes or failures will basically raise the war weariness amongst the European publics, especially but also America, and may lead politicians and policymakers across Europe and the United States and Canada, of course, as well, to basically force the Ukrainians into some sort of peace negotiations, which would not bid well for Ukraine.
I mean, 20% of Ukrainian territory is still occupied by Russia, and if you include Crimea and Donbass.
Very much so. And just to put it into context, that is the size of the state of Tennessee. 42,000 square miles. So that's a lot of territory that they have occupied.
Natalia Kushko, let me jump around a little bit here. Tell us so you're working with small Ukrainian businesses, you're working with the people who are trying to bring humanitarian relief and the recipients of the humanitarian aid, which I should say, frankly, is as everyone to a certain extent. So how critical is this moment from the perspective of the Ukrainians who you are helping, who you're interacting with? And what is their level of hope and coping at this moment?
That's a great question. I think there's a difference between a person just have a job or don't have a job, or if they're entrepreneurs. Because when I talk to entrepreneurs, they always bring up the idea that they have a special front, they have an entrepreneurship front, and they're saying that we cannot close our business because if we close our business, we will lose our employees, and our employees, we need to flee the country. So there's a lot of hope. And when I asked them about their plans for the future, not even one person told me, I don't believe in Ukraine. They say everything they're doing right now at the moment is for Ukraine, for our future. They don't see a situation that Ukraine doesn't win. Of course, they're worried, and they see this war being for so long, but there's so much hope in every single answer. It's unbelievable. And about humanitarian efforts. So in the beginning of the war, we were getting a lot of requests to get bulletproof jackets. We were getting a lot of requests to get some medical aid. Now the requests are completely different. But the Ukrainians are preparing. And the stuff that we're doing right now is so different.
Prepared for what?
For getting back our territories. Exactly. And what we're preparing now, okay, if we deoccupy some territory, we will have a lot of people who are suffering. And for the first 2 months, usually we didn't have electricity, they didn't have water. So okay, we need generators for that part of the territory. I recently was interviewing a person who was in occupied territory. And she was telling me, that we're doing this to Zoom, and I cannot talk to my family who is in Ukraine because I know I say something not pro-Russian, they will come after me. I was like, okay, this is so anonymous, nobody's gonna know your name or anything. But even people who are in occupation have so much hope. They believe that Ukrainians are coming.
Natalie Rice, let me jump to you. Russia has never seen fighting this war strictly in the context of the military. Active measures, as we call them, are a century old, whether it's economic, cyber attacks, hacking, and information warfare. And in this moment, Russia continues to try and sway public opinion in Ukraine and its ally Belarus, and countries that lean West Georgia. What are those narratives, and are they effective?
That's a very good question. Thank you so much for asking. And I will be using some of the data from the Nevada Center, which is the most well-trusted survey company in Russia that is still operating the still public opinion polls, and also some of the data that our research project at UT here is collecting in Georgia, Belarus, and Ukraine. And you're absolutely right that Putin has been using information warfare and his propaganda machine for a very long time to prepare people inside of his country and the other former Soviet Union countries for action. And media monitoring that we have been doing of the Russian sources based in Russia, but also pro-Russian sources in these countries, have been showing us that about 6 months before the beginning of the war, there was this new narrative that showed up, which is it is the West, there's the threat of the military invasion from NATO countries, from the United States, and from Ukraine into our territory. And in those 6 months, this amount of the stories that had this narrative just had a skyrocket. So you see, by the time they were preparing the public opinion, especially inside of Russia, for that invasion. And it's important to say that, if you listen to Putin's speeches, like he had been calling Ukrainian Nazis and using words like fascist, something that really resonates with the Russian public opinion. But in the past 6 months, they have actually changed some of their narratives. And although they're still saying that Ukraine provoked the war, NATO provoked the war, but now they're focusing on this is a civilizational struggle between us, the great Russian civilization, and all of the West. And Ukraine is just a place where the Western civilization and mainly the United States of America is fighting the great Russian civilization. And that narrative is everywhere, from Putin to Medvedev, the former president of Russia, who said, we don't need a world without Russia. And that just tells you how much the rhetoric is changing. And they're trying to get public support for the war effort. And so far, it's doing a pretty good job. The latest numbers from the Nevada centers actually show that about 70% of Russians support the war effort to different extent. I think 43% of people are saying they completely support, and the rest of them are saying they partly support. But still, every single month since the beginning of the war, the support for the war is going up. And only 16% of Russians, as of April, said that they are against the war.
And there's an obvious question there. Just explain, why do we trust a polling outfit and, a state in which the leading opposition figure is accused of being an Al-Qaeda terrorist, and, a lot of people who oppose the regime end up being thrown out windows?
Yes, that's a very good question. And of course, in authoritarian countries, there's always a question about the public opinion polling, but Nevada Center has a stellar reputation. And I think why it matters to listen to them is because there were several West-based public opinion polling institutions that have done very similar polls, and they have produced exactly the same results. Now, they also have to take into consideration that there was some of the people who did not support the war, over many of them actually left Russia within the past year. So, of course, it might have been higher if people were still staying in Russia, because people who were against the war and people who did not want to actually construct and go fight, they left.
Because I wonder, so we've gone through how important this moment is for Ukraine and for the West, dipped a little bit into Ukrainians' businesses and how they're coping, and the hope that we've got. We've gotten a sense of Russian opinion and also Russian information. The source of Ukraine's military power is not only the bravery and creativity of its was 200,000, now 600,000 Ukrainian armed forces. It is the $100 billion that I mentioned in the top in the United States, but crucially, the $75 billion in the political supporters got you for Europe. And so how critical is it, and how do you see whether there's unity in Europe, of course, between the East and the West, and how fragile is it, depending on how the counteroffensive goes, if it doesn't go as well as Ukraine hopes?
Thank you. That's an excellent question. And I think it's absolutely key. So the support is crucial, and any victory scenario has to depend upon it. All the more so as Ukraine is trying to move closer to Europe. But the problem, the devil's always in the details, right? And to speak of what Europe is doing or what NATO is doing, we use that as a shorthand, and that's useful, but it can hide ambiguities and potential frictions and problems. And so, and many of those differences or potential rifts, even in alliances or associations, have a lot to do with historical experience, which is very varied. So to take an example that's absolutely recent, in the last few days, Germany's Leopard 2 tanks have been finally delivered, and German opinion was very split on. there's a slight edge in favor of delivery of heavy weaponry, but an almost equal number, slightly less, that are opposed to it. And when you look at the German political landscape, this is going to be the stuff to write dissertations about in political science, by the way. The country is deeply divided itself. The former East Germany, which used to be communist, registers very different opinions and much greater reluctance to help Ukraine or even to see Ukraine as not being part of Russia than is the case in the West. And there are generational divides as well, with older citizens being much more eager to have Germany play an active role than a younger generation. And if that weren't bad enough, the political landscape has been scrambled as well, where the extreme left and extreme right political groupings in East Germany are actually in agreement about let's not get involved in the Ukrainian struggle. So all of this has historical reasons. Germany's reluctance to play a strong military role because of what that's looked like in the past, with two world wars as an important example. The reaction by other European and NATO partners who are closer to Ukraine has really been strong, telling the Germans, you need to do more. So even as the Leopard 2 tanks are on their way, the Estonian defense minister is announcing to Germany's main magazine, Der Spiegel, Germany needs to do more. Germany needs to do as much as we, tiny Estonia, is doing in terms of defense spending and aid. In the case of Poland, think of the vast outpouring of relief efforts that has gone to helping refugee populations, when many expert observers said Poland and Ukraine have had very divided relations in the past. There'll be no such outpouring. So the experts have been wrong on a lot of these opinions. Poles have been anxious about Germany's historical role, but now in a different way. A few years ago, the Prime Minister of Poland, Radek Sikorski, said what keeps him awake at night is not German power, but German inaction. And so that's a key problem. The final thing I want to note is all of these events have even bigger ramifications, as became clear just a few days ago when China's ambassador to Paris, to France, declared in an off-the-cuff declaration that Ukraine and other ex-Soviet countries don't really have the status of being participants in international relations.
Although Beijing is quickly watching back.
They watched it back and said that was a purely private opinion with being press. They're very public forum. The reactions on the part of Eastern Europeans have been vitriolic. But this can't pass without comment. And so it's just as was said a moment ago. There's unexpected factors that are likely to be into play, and so we're going to pay attention to those details.
Sure. We're going to dip a little bit into the past because I don't think we can truly understand this without doing that. So let's pass the mic down here. Alice Fossey, is Putin, in your opinion, a singularly aggressive figure, or does he instead reflect Russian imperial historic ambition?
Well, he is one in light of many Russian functionaries in the service of the state, from the Tsarist Empire to the Soviet Union to Yeltsin and Putin. They all served the motherland, to put it in Russian terms, basically in service of the state, making Russia great, not only in terms of the territory, but making Russia great in terms of standing, prestige, and then, of course, economically. Of course, their power outside the military and territorially has gone up and down over the times. But nonetheless, there's that aspiration. There is something unique about Russian elite psyche, that they need to have this acknowledgement from the West that Russia is a great power. And one way they want to show their great power status is through war. Now, they could have gone a different route and show their great power status by inventing cancer drugs, inventing technology, quantum technology, do public service to mankind in terms of innovation, the way the Japanese, the Koreans currently, and the Germans have done. But they haven't done that. And it is one of the mistakes that we have made out in the West to term this as Putin's war. This is not Putin's war on Ukraine. This is Russia's war on Ukraine. This is not the Kremlin's. Exactly. And as Dan pointed out, the Russian people are behind Vladimir Putin. And if Vladimir Putin is not to be tomorrow, due to poor health reasons, because it always happens that in Russia, every leader falls ill and they die of disease. They all face natural deaths. Not one of them is overthrown in one way or another.
Naturally thrown.
Exactly. So the expectation is that they would pursue this. And we have the history to be this, basically this map that shows us what the future may hold. Because historically, since the 1600s, Russia has tended to expand. And that expanse has come at about 50 to 60 miles per day over a 300-year period. So when we tend to think of Russia, think 11 time zone. We are the third largest country. In the mainland, we have 3 time zones, if we were to keep Hawaii out and Alaska. So 11 time zones. And whoever the next person is, they're bound to have the same approach to wanting to incorporate those lands that they tend to view are historically theirs. And I'm not sure that there will be any change in that elite. Medvedev, when he was president in 2008, I believe, he was viewed by the Westerners as this great liberal leader, this new range of new generation of leaders, young, and that he has been socialized not into the Soviet thinking, but post-Cold War thinking. And now he is as big of a warmonger as Putin is. So there's something to be said about that.
Let me go back to Professor Bulovikas, because he is the historian on the panel. Is that how you see it, that the past, Russian past, can tell us about the present, but also, what do you see in Russian past that helps us understand how we got here, invasion in Ukraine, the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, but also some of the mistakes?
I think, I guess I would emphasize a misunderstanding of the past. Willful, by Putin and by the elites. And I agree entirely that Putin is probably more an expression of many common traits rather than being a historical actor who's setting Russia on an entirely new course. And it's precisely this that I think has led to massive miscalculations from the outset. I mean, whatever the outcome is, and no matter if Putin later engages in strategic withdrawal and then declares victory, it's clear that his expectations have been entirely frustrated. The anticipation that this would be a secret and highly surgical strike, a police action not rising to the level of war, I think Ukraine would just be pulled back into an imperial structure, was incredibly bad intelligence and also a really bad historical reading of the situation. And behind all of this is not just the notion of gathering the Russian lands, but also the historical conviction that other people's assertions of their identity, who they are as peoples, don't really count. They don't really matter in view of a larger imperial mission. And so Putin and his cronies tap into an older history of considering Ukrainians or Belarusians or the Baltic peoples as just sort of folkloristic versions or deviations from a great Russian model. And that, unfortunately, is not universally held, but it's a strong belief that one can have in the elites more generally, to the point where some of these ultra-nationalists will declare that to be Ukrainian, that's a disease, that's a disorder, and they're going to reimpose order. And I only mention these paranoid fantasies and distortions to point out that when you set out for these assumptions, defeat is always pre-programmed. Because if you, from your great pan-Slavic love of neighboring Slavic peoples, go in and try to annihilate them in order to bring them back into the imperial structure, you're defeated from the very outset. And it's for this reason that
We found so many people who were speaking up on the Ukrainian side, wanting to present themselves as willing to cooperate with Putin. Yesterday's marvelous set of interviews, the Deutsche Welle reporter said that he experienced how Ukrainians feel different, and I think this is the reaction to those who are fantasies.
So that brings us to Natalia Yukushko. This is really important. So, and this will connect the conversation we have with the past, with the present. So, you're from Crimea, right? Even Crimea voted in 1991 for independence, but a lower percentage. There is a historic sense that Ukraine has been divided between Russian and Ukrainian speakers, between West and East, between people who look to the West and people who look to the East. So explain that from your perspective. But crucially, the last point that was made, which is what has changed today? What level of unity do you believe truly exists in Ukraine that didn't exist before?
And actually, I wanted to jump in, and it's so hard for me to face that like privilege. I was born already in a mother country, right? So my opinion is much stronger than my parents' opinion, right? Russia has this narrative that the Soviet Union invented Ukraine, right? So Ukraine is just a story. But I love that U.S. embassy in Ukraine posted on their social media. Ukraine in the 965 year, and then Russia is its home. Like, we really started building churches. Russia didn't exist that time, right? So since so many years, Russia is trying to create this narrative that they're so much better, that they were first. It doesn't matter who we're first, right? It matters that we are the nation. We are the independent nation, right? And then now they started kidnapping kids. And a lot of Americans, they're asking me, why are they doing that? Why are they kidnapping kids? It's like they're trying to crush our identity. They're trying to reprogram those kids. Because adults are much harder. They're already set in stones, right? But you can reprogram kids. You can embed the idea that Ukraine didn't exist, actually. And then 40 years, when those kids will grow up, Russia can interview them. So, also tell me about Ukraine. And those kids will tell you, Ukraine didn't exist. So that's their master plan. The other thing is, in the beginning of the 90s, what Soviet Unions did, they went to Ukraine and they created genocide. They went into every single home in Ukraine and they destroyed their food. They surrounded cities.
Sorry, you meant early 20th century. Yeah. 1930s,
Yeah. So Russia has been doing it for so long. So now, when I'm born in an independent country, right, and people are asking me, so how do you feel about Russia? How do you feel about that? You speak Ukrainian, but you're from Crimea. How is it possible? I was like, we never had a problem like that. But that's a Russian narrative again. Yes, there's so many people in Ukraine who speak Russian. It doesn't matter. But it really doesn't matter. Like, as long as you believe that you're against the war and you have good intentions, it doesn't matter what language you speak. You're from the U.S., you come to Ukraine and you speak English. Nobody ever said anything to you, right? Exactly.
They might say, why didn't you speak Ukrainian? It's been a fact.
But
and so just explain quickly that even when I interview, the mayors from a party that is quote unquote pro-Russian, that's a little simplified, but mayors who are still in power in places like Kharkiv, places like Odessa, places like Kryvyi Rih, those three men in particular were kind of singular thorns in the side of the pro-European Ukrainians. To a man, each of them pledges loyalty to Ukraine and refuses to speak Russian, even in an interview with American media. What is this?
same thing happened to me, actually. When I'm interviewing Ukrainian entrepreneurs in those regions, they speak the native language, let's say, with Russian, right?
Comfortable.
Right. But they always apologize for that. Like, I'm so sorry for it. I'm so sorry. Now, when you speak Ukrainian, it's a piece that unites people. It shows that you're pro-Ukraine. And especially if you experience it, see what Russia did to you, to your kids, to your neighbor, and then you associate yourself with Russian language, you try to disconnect yourself as much as you can.
Natalie Rice, you talked about the support for the war in Russia. What we're talking about is the support for the war inside Ukraine, despite Russian attempts in the information space to try and reduce that support. What do you see in terms of polling, whether it's Ukrainians themselves or their resistance to some of this outside pressure or outside active measures that, frankly, some of which worked at that?
That is a very, very good question. And a lot of speakers have been saying that with Putin starting his war, he made his own fears real. So that was in NATO. And other things that he was afraid of were publicly saying that these are the threats to the Russian world, to the Russian mentality, to the Russian spectrum, populations in the trenches. They turned out to be true. Because before the war, according to public opinion polls, parts of the eastern Ukraine still had a lot of pro-Russian feelings. They were speaking the Russian language. They were voting for the pro-Russian parties. So Eastern Ukraine and Western Ukraine, two very different things. And then by Putin starting his war, now Eastern Ukraine, those people who are being bombed, they don't support Russia anymore.
He's created the very nation that he claimed didn't.
Exactly. Just the same way that has created, the NATO problem with his war, which didn't exist before the war. So he created this problem for himself.
Yeah. All right. So we got 5 minutes. We'll do a speed round here about the future. So don't worry. I won't make the historian predict the future. Just all right. So Natalia, that's to start us off. And just quickly, you each have about a minute. So explain the point that I made, that in my opinion, I think is this, but please, tell us what you think, that when a country experiences so much pain, what do they demand? And therefore, what do they want? And therefore, what will they keep fighting for, and for how long?
So the first thing, we are demanding the truth and we are demanding the justice. Because if you see so many kids being killed in front of you, it's impossible to say it doesn't matter, because it does matter. And you mentioned that this war might go for a long, long time. It might happen just because we value our people. And the problem is that we send to the war the best people. Russia sent the worst people. So our quality of people are amazing for defending our country. So I do believe this war is going to be maybe for 2 more years. But we do demand the truth, the justice, and we demand people to be heard and go back to the 1991 territory.
And so, Alice Velazquez, what is the strategic implication of the fact that 91% of Ukrainians say victory is Crimea, and frankly, with all due respect to the Ukrainian military, most U.S. officials, military intelligence, do not think they can achieve?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, right? The Ukrainians deserve the freedom and liberation of all of their territories, including Crimea. Back in 1995, the United States, alongside Great Britain, France, Russian Federation, as well as China, guaranteed Ukrainian territorial sovereignty and integrity in exchange for Ukraine's nuclear arsenal to go back to Russia. And we know now that none of these parties basically guaranteed the security. So the key is, one, the Ukrainians deserve all of their territory back. But the trick is how much of the Ukrainian territory returning to the Ukrainian fold are the Ukrainian allies willing to support? And how much of the Ukrainian territory are the Russians willing to give up at the negotiating? Winning the war is not that hard. Of course, the war is very, very difficult. But what we have seen over the last 30 years, that the United States and the European allies are great at supporting war efforts in winning wars around the world. And we are very good, even excellent, at losing the peace. And the peace we lose to appeasement. And there have been a lot of discussions around the European capitals as to what sort of concessions we need to make to Russia in order to get them to stop at some junction within the Ukrainian territory. And we do not know that yet.
Yeah. Natalie Rice, the fire hose of falsehood. We talk about this. That's a phrase that Peter Pomerantsev uses. Is that the future, that we're just going to be sopping wet with all sorts of propaganda, misinformation?
Just to explain it to the audience, that is a theoretical framework that explains how Russian propaganda works. That they don't just have one story, they don't have one general party line like the Soviets used to have at some point. And it's the fact that if you look at the Russian news sources, they are giving multiple stories, multiple accounts, conspiracy theories, and explaining one event with 50 different things to convince people that are watching them there is no such thing as objective truth. And that has been very successful for them. So I think they will continue doing that. They're definitely continue doing that right now in their coverage of the war, and it seems to be pretty objective. Because when you look at some very interesting interviews that the Levada Center in-depth interviews did with Russians lately, so many people are saying, we just don't believe the news. We don't believe Telegram. We don't believe anything else. We don't think anybody is objective. And that's exactly what would be worse. She wants people to think that there's no objective truth.
Yeah. As Leviticus, you have the last word. I'm asking a historian to predict the future. So I'll ask a version of the question that I think is kind of brings us back to where we started, which is got a counteroffensive. Critical that Ukraine has some success. But what happens if it's only so much success? Or what happens if someone in some European capital in Berlin or Paris thinks it's not a success? Or what happens, frankly, in Washington if, where the Republicans were doubting this war, it's not enough success?
So I think that the key question is how success is defined, right? And you mentioned the ambitions, entirely understandable of Ukrainians to reclaim all of this. I think that from my perspective, without trying to predict the future, there's a way in which Ukraine already has won and has had a huge effect, and that is to frustrate a lot of the experts, whether they're military experts or political experts, who are convinced that Kyiv would fall immediately, the leadership would scatter, and some new structure would be built entirely at the whim of Putin. And I think that this is going to have a worldwide effect, and is already having a worldwide effect in terms of, let's say, if China is making aggressive moves on Taiwan, the calculus looks very different than it would have about 5 years ago. And I think the showing the power of our people power, essentially, of a mobilized population that knows what it wants, is committed for it, is going to have a catalytic effect worldwide. And that falls short of the success that we've talked about in territorial terms, but that's huge. That's really huge in world historical terms.
But Natalia Kushel did you the last word quickly. But in fact, you use justice. Is Ukrainian justice fiction?
Yes. And the world will acknowledge that Russia is a terrorist state.
So, all right. I think we got a couple minutes, right, for questions? Yeah? Great. Okay. So please identify yourself, turn your hands up, and we'll do a couple of quick questions here. Yeah, please.
My name's David Bertrand, student with the history department. I was curious what the difference was between the public support is invasion of Russia versus like the first Chechen war versus like why there was so much backlash for the Russian government at that time.
That is a very good question, and definitely the Russian public is now in a very different place than they have been with the Chechen war. And Chechnya, of course, is part of the Russian territory, and so for them it was a domestic war. They didn't have to sell this opinion that we need to go and deal with Chechnya, especially because so many terrorist acts were happening. The Russian authorities were blaming the Chechen terrorists, and in many cases it was accurate. In some cases, Mossad on that, and so it's different. And in terms of the war today, the fact that there's growing public support for that war is specifically because they're telling it for Russian TV and for people that watch it in such a way that literally, the houses of the Ukrainians that are being blown up, if we wouldn't go into the break, these would be your houses. That is how they're selling this war. And that is why there is such strong support for it. And they don't really get, most of the people who watch Russian TV, any objective information about what actually is going on in Ukraine. They don't see. And they're being forced back this thing that we have a civilizational conflict going on. And the fate of Russia is basing how this war is going to go. And that's why there's such a strong public support for it.
Yeah, interesting. All right, Andres, you're yet. Any other questions for our panel? Right. So yeah.
Hey, I'm curious if maybe has any ideas like
what sorts of things did it take to create the Russian Republic that would be its purpose?
And what does it take?
What to create a Russian Republic that is in support of wars like this? Like what sorts of cultivation? Is there from culture?
What led to this support? Okay, Alice, you want to start with that?
Well, in the East, there is a lot of emphasis placed on these narratives. They pass as history, but they are basically mythology. Stories that are non-existent. And countless generations of Russian citizens have been educated with these narratives that are not grounded in facts. The great and the glorious Russian nations. It was the Russia that saved the world from Nazism. It is the Russia that saved the world from Muslim invaders in the 1400s and the 1500s. Russia is always portraying itself as the savior, not only of the Russians, but also of the Western civilization. And a lot of countless generations have been born, raised, and died with these stories. So in order to change that narrative, you really need several different generations of Russians that are educated with historical facts so that they know their place in the world in the past, now, and in the future, and not to necessarily buy. But that is very difficult to accomplish. A lot easier said than done, because once you grow with these myths, it is almost a heresy to start to question them, let alone supplant them for something else. What is true?
That's a very good point, and I just wanted to add something that, when the Soviet Union collapsed, the Russian public was traumatized in a very, very, very major way. And it's interesting too, if you look at the public opinion polls that were already conducted in Russia, at the time when the Russian Federation was born, the Soviet Union collapsed, they loved America, they loved the West. So many people wanted to live the same way that Western Europe or the United States does. Next 10 years, when the Russian economy went through a very difficult time, and people went, unemployed, terrible economy, they got this feeling that they were tricked. Hey, we wanted to live just like the United States. We gave up our country, we gave up our ideology. What did we get in return? And Putin knew that this frustration, which couples together with the fact that for many, many, many centuries, Russia thought of themselves as the great power, and that was so important for their national side. Putin exploited that very well. And he knew that this is going to work, and he tried it several times before. In 2008, when his rating was pretty low, and he invaded Georgia and was still fought for their territory, 20% jump in his support. Exactly the same thing happened in Crimea. So he knew that showing himself as a great military leader will really boost his support. And he has an election next year. So I think that kind of explains how does the Russian public, why they react in this way.
And how many of the older generation today still sees Putin as the person who provided stability.
Absolutely.
In 2000s, as opposed to the chaos that I do now.
Absolutely.
Yeah. The younger generation doesn't necessarily feel the same way, but the grandparents, the parents often do. I shouldn't say everything, but often. All right, any other questions before we wrap lines? Yeah, please.
Barring not, so I just wonder, I just kind of be opening to tie all of this back to the idea that the importance of journalism and good storytelling. Is there any hope for us in the work of journalists?
No. I mean, well, I'll take your question because the panel's really in depth. So, well, Natalie, why don't you? Sorry, Natalia, why don't you take that, because you do your own storytelling, you do your own interviewing, and you use the word hope. So why should we have hope?
That's a great question, and it's a hard question. Let's say that. So it's important to show what's actually happening, right? Because we know that if you go to Russia, there's so much propaganda, right? So they're showing fake stories. So for us, and for this journalism, and for me, I'm doing qualitative research, I'm still presenting stories, right? But in a research field. So it's important to show what's actually happening and how people are dealing through this war. Because any other war, like World War II, World War I, people couldn't see it all live. People didn't see this destruction. People didn't see the horror that families are experiencing. Now, we can show everybody. Like we can show how the war looks like. Even you sitting at home, you can connect any war story from the TV to any Ukrainians, to your family. Being a mom, being a dad, you can connect yourself. That's a huge effort. The other thing is, Russia started invading not Ukraine but other countries years before, right? So, and they see that nothing is happening to them. They invaded Georgia, they did that, nothing is happening. So if Ukraine doesn't wait, Russia will invade any other country that they want. So this is super important. We are not fighting just against Russia. We call the war against good and bad.
Hope and victory.
All right, I think we're about out of time, but if there's any one last question, I think we can entertain it. But otherwise, we can let people finish up their lunch. And well, thank you so much for all of you guys for participating. Thank you for hosting. Yeah, thank you for having us, and thank you all. Really appreciate it. Thank
On his hand.
Thank you so much.
You know,